The email's subject line punched me in the chest: family reunion venue change. Exciting update. I stared at my screen, cold spreading through my body as I clicked to open it. For 27 consecutive years, I had reserved the Lakeside Pavilion for our family's annual reunion. 27 years of meticulous planning and carefully preserved traditions. Dear family, the message began in my daughter-in-law's unmistakable style, though it bore my name in the signature. Elizabeth and I have decided it's time to modernize our gathering this year. Instead of the usual outdated venue, we've secured reservations at Le Bistro for an elegant dining experience worthy of our family. My throat constricted so tightly I could barely swallow. I hadn't decided anything. I hadn't even been consulted. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, trembling as I read further. The Lakeside Pavilion reservation, placed 11 months in advance, as I always did, had been canceled. The $750 non-refundable deposit was gone. In its place, Vanessa had committed to a minimum $2,500 expenditure at an upscale restaurant where children couldn't play and elderly relatives couldn't comfortably sit for hours. I sat completely still for 20 seconds, the only sound my grandmother's clock ticking and my increasingly shallow breathing. My hands moved automatically to align my notepad perfectly parallel to the keyboard, a habit from 35 years as the county's historical archivist. This wasn't the first time Vanessa had decided to help since she'd married my son James 2 years ago. 6 months earlier, she'd reorganized my kitchen cabinets without asking, discarding recipe cards I'd preserved for decades. 3 months ago, she'd redecorated the guest room that had housed the family archives. Last month, she'd refreshed the holiday decorations I'd cataloged for 3 decades. Each time, James had defended her. "Mom, Vanessa's just trying to help. You should appreciate having someone care enough to update things." Update, modernize, refresh. The words people use when they believe your life's work is obsolete. I'd spent my career preserving history that others deemed unimportant, fighting to protect records of ordinary lives against those who only valued the exceptional. Now my own family history, the traditions I'd built since before James could walk, was being discarded with the same casual disregard. I checked my calendar and found a notification I hadn't created for a family planning session at James and Vanessa's home tomorrow evening. Another decision made without consulting me. When my doorbell rang an hour later, I straightened my shoulders by bare millimeters, smoothed my cardigan, and crossed to answer it. The woman wasn't a stranger, but my former colleague, Martha, clutching a folder to her chest. "Elizabeth, thank goodness you're home. The Historical Society has a situation with the Harrington collection, and Rebecca suggested I consult with the retired staff." Martha's voice carried the particular tone we developed when administrative decisions were questionable. "She's cataloged the diary as 1865 when it's clearly—" I gestured Martha inside, feeling the familiar surge of professional confidence. "The handwriting analysis alone confirms the later date, not to mention Eliza's references to the mill fire." "Exactly," Martha exclaimed. "I told Rebecca you literally wrote the manual on dating local historical documents, but she insisted your methods were traditional, and they're using updated protocols now." The word struck like a physical blow. Traditional. The same dismissal Vanessa used whenever she encountered something I valued. "Rebecca mentioned you'll be at the fundraiser Thursday," Martha continued. "I know it's awkward since Vanessa's friend Audrey took over your position, but we really need your expertise." I moved toward my desk, straightening a picture frame to perfect alignment. "I've been relegated to the refreshments table. Actually, the admission burned my throat. Apparently my skills are better suited to pouring wine than discussing historical collections." Martha's indignation warmed me slightly. "That's absurd. You built that collection from nothing. 35 years of expertise doesn't evaporate because you retired." The parallel wasn't lost on me. Dismissed as irrelevant at the Historical Society, just as in my own home. As I helped Martha locate my research notes, I found myself standing straighter, speaking with more authority. After she left, I returned to my computer and opened my digital archives. While everyone assumed I was clinging to outdated methods, I digitized our family records years ago. Every photograph, recipe, and handwritten account, all preserved with professional care in both physical and digital formats. What my family didn't know, what Vanessa couldn't possibly guess, was that I'd spent the past 6 months creating something extraordinary from these archives. I clicked through to the nearly completed digital file, feeling warmth replace the cold in my chest. If they believed I was just a fading, outdated woman who could be brushed aside without consequence, they had fundamentally misunderstood who they were dealing with. This wasn't merely about a family reunion. This was about whether my life's work, both professional and personal, would be valued or discarded. For 27 years, I had preserved our family's history with the same precision I'd brought to my career. I would not allow that history to be erased by someone who'd been present for barely 2. I closed my laptop, my breathing steadier. Vanessa had no idea what I was capable of. It was time she learned. My first day at the County Historical Society in 1988 remains etched in my memory with archival precision. I stood before rows of neglected documents, letters, diaries, photographs, many deteriorating in inadequate storage. "What exactly do you plan to do with all this?" my supervisor had asked skeptically. "Preserve it," I'd answered without hesitation. Every family's history matters, not just the wealthy or famous ones. I still remember the weight of my first archival box, the cool touch of acid-free paper, the faint scent of document preservation spray. My fingertips could distinguish paper types blindfolded, an ability that eventually earned me regional recognition. By retirement 3 years ago, I had transformed a haphazard collection into one of the most comprehensive community archives in the state. My documentation standards became protocol for 3 neighboring counties. My paper on preservation techniques for rural community archives was required reading in regional museum studies programs, none of which impressed my daughter-in-law, Vanessa. "Mom has always been obsessed with old things," James explained when introducing us, as if my career had been an eccentric hobby. I'd smiled tightly, aligning the silverware at perfect right angles beside my plate. I hadn't always been this invisible. When James was growing up, our home was his center of gravity, a warm, orderly space where neighborhood children gathered. While I kept meticulous records professionally, at home I maintained traditions rather than mere order. "Mom, remember when you dressed as a historical figure for my 4th grade project?" James had asked at dinner 2 months ago. Vanessa interrupted him mid-sentence. "Speaking of projects, we need to redo that outdated kitchen if we're ever going to sell this place." Sell this place. The home I'd maintained for 33 years, with the $85,000 mortgage I'd paid entirely myself. The house where I'd raised James alone after his father left, taking weekend cataloging jobs so my son could attend college without debt. James had nodded enthusiastically. "It would definitely raise the value. Mom won't want to maintain this big house forever." They discussed my home, my future, as if I weren't sitting directly across from them, as if these decisions were naturally theirs to make. When James first brought Vanessa to dinner, I'd made an extraordinary effort. I'd prepared his favorite foods, set the table with my grandmother's china, and shared family stories. Elizabeth was the county's chief archivist, James had explained proudly. "How nice," Vanessa had replied, in the same tone one acknowledges a child's crayon drawing. My mother was on the board of the Metropolitan Museum fundraising committee. The slate had burned, but I'd maintained my composure. I understood in-law relationships. When my mother-in-law criticized my housekeeping decades earlier, I'd remained respectful despite the hurt. "You'll need to step up your standards now that you have a family," she'd instructed, running a finger along my bookshelf to check for dust while I balanced infant James on my hip. I'd been determined to create a different relationship with my own son's wife. But as weeks became months, Vanessa's dismissive attitude hardened into a pattern. When I offered to help plan their wedding, she declined, explaining they needed a more current aesthetic. When I shared family recipes, she suggested healthier, updated versions. When I mentioned my professional background, she redirected the conversation to her marketing career. The pattern extended beyond our personal relationship. 3 months after retirement, I'd volunteered to organize a special exhibition at the Historical Society, only to have the new director, Vanessa's college friend Audrey, assign me to stuffing envelopes. "We're taking a more contemporary approach to the collections," Audrey had explained, inspecting her manicure. I'd continued volunteering despite the humiliation, my expertise ignored, as I was relegated to increasingly menial tasks. The family reunion held particular significance. I'd started the tradition the year after James's father left, determined to give my son a sense of belonging, despite our fractured immediate family. Each year, I meticulously documented the gathering, photographs labeled with names and dates, menus preserved, recordings of elderly relatives sharing memories. I created an evolving historical record of our family, applying professional standards. For 27 consecutive years, I'd reserved the Lakeside Pavilion, coordinated potluck assignments, and organized activities spanning generations. I spent approximately $1,000 annually, never asking for contributions because I considered it my gift to the family. Last year was the first reunion with Vanessa as James's wife. She arrived 3 hours late, complained about the rustic setting, and left early. Afterward, I overheard her telling James it was embarrassingly unsophisticated and not the impression we want to make on my colleagues. I hadn't defended the gathering then. I'd quietly packed away the documentation and told myself next year would be different. Now, facing Vanessa's unilateral venue change, I realized my silence had been interpreted as surrender. A memory surfaced from early in my career. A wealthy resident had attempted to block preservation of ordinary family histories, arguing only prominent citizens deserved space in the archives. "History isn't just about prominent individuals," I'd stated during the contentious board meeting. "It's about communities. Every family's story contributes to our collective understanding." I'd won that battle through quiet persistence and meticulous documentation. The preservation program I developed became a model for rural communities across the state. Now I needed to apply that same determination to preserving my own place in my family's story. The dinner at James and Vanessa's loomed the following evening. I spent hours reviewing my digital archives, selecting specific photographs and documents I'd integrated into my secret project. When I arrived, Vanessa was arranging an elaborate charcuterie board while James mixed drinks. "Mom, perfect timing," he said, kissing my cheek. Vanessa was just explaining her vision for the reunion. "I'm more interested in hearing about this venue change," I replied, maintaining a neutral tone despite the renewed constriction in my throat. "I've already paid the non-refundable deposit for the pavilion," Vanessa waved dismissively. "That old park is so dated. Le Bistro provides a much more sophisticated experience." "Le Bistro can't accommodate half our usual attendance," I noted. "The pavilion allows children to play safely while older relatives rest comfortably." "About that," Vanessa interjected, "we thought we'd limit attendance this year. Focus on immediate family rather than distant cousins. No one really knows." The hollow feeling in my stomach expanded. These distant cousins included people who'd held infant James, who'd supported us after his father left, who'd celebrated every milestone in his life. The whole point of a family reunion is bringing together extended family who might otherwise lose connection, I said, my voice dropping to the authoritative register I'd used during board presentations. "Mom, it's just an upgrade," James interrupted, his placating tone scraping against my nerves. "Why are you making this difficult? Vanessa's gone to a lot of trouble." Without consulting me, I pointed out. After I'd already made arrangements. Because you always resist change, Vanessa replied. We're just trying to make things easier for you at your age. At my age, as if 62 rendered me incapable of hosting an event I'd managed for nearly 3 decades. I've coordinated more complex gatherings than you can imagine, I said, straightening imperceptibly. I managed the Historical Society's collections and public programming for 35 years. That was before you retired, Vanessa replied, emphasizing the word as if it meant became irrelevant. I maintained perfect composure throughout dinner, asking measured questions about the restaurant while calculating the financial implications. Le Bistro's minimum expenditure would exclude family members on fixed incomes. The formal setting would restrict children's movement. The 2-hour limit would prevent the organic conversations that yielded the most meaningful family stories. After dessert, I excused myself to the restroom. Passing their home office, I noticed James's laptop open to an email draft. I paused, my archivist's eye automatically scanning, discussing putting the house on the market when Elizabeth is ready for a retirement community. The cold sensation intensified, spreading through my chest and limbs. They weren't just taking over the family reunion. They were planning my entire future without me. In the privacy of their guest bathroom, I gripped the sink's edge, finally allowing my composed expression to crumble. Tears filled my eyes, blurring my reflection. 35 years preserving history, I whispered, and I can't even preserve my place in my own family. For 1 minute exactly, I permitted myself this private breakdown. Then, with the precision that had defined my professional life, I washed my face, reapplied makeup, and straightened my posture. As I drove home, a new resolve crystallized. If they wanted to erase Elizabeth Watson, they would first need to understand exactly who Elizabeth Watson was. The Historical Society fundraiser arrived on a Thursday evening, typically my favorite event of the season. I'd organized it for 30 years before retirement, transforming it from a stuffy reception into a community celebration of shared heritage. Now I stood behind the refreshment table, assigned to pour wine rather than discuss the exhibits I'd spent decades curating. Elizabeth, so lovely to see you volunteering, Rebecca Chen, the new director, greeted me with condescension reserved for the elderly. She adjusted her glasses before continuing. The wine goes in the larger glasses, dear. I'd designed the Society's cataloging system, written its procedural manual, and secured its most significant grants. Now I was being instructed on glassware. I'm familiar with the table settings, Rebecca, I replied steadily. I selected them in 2008 when we updated the event format. Rebecca's smile tightened. Of course. How easy to forget you've been around so long. She turned as Vanessa entered with expensively dressed guests. Vanessa, your marketing insights have been transformative. I maintained my neutral expression as Rebecca led Vanessa toward a display case containing the Harrington collection, my final major acquisition before retirement. For 20 minutes, I poured wine with mechanical precision, aligning each glass perfectly, while watching Vanessa guide potential donors through what had once been my domain. This diary clearly dates to 1865. I overheard Vanessa explaining confidently to an elderly gentleman whose name tag identified him as Dr. Richard Winters, which makes it particularly valuable as it references the final days of the Civil War. The hollowness in my stomach gave way to sharp clarity. The Harrington diary was unquestionably from 1875. I'd published an entire paper on this document, including handwriting analysis and paper composition verification. Elizabeth, we need more wine glasses, Audrey called from across the room, clearly attempting to redirect me as I'd begun moving toward the display. I set down the wine bottle with deliberate care. 27 years of hosting family gatherings had taught me to move through uncomfortable social situations with grace. 35 years of defending historical accuracy had taught me when silence became complicity. The Harrington Diary was written in 1875, I said, my voice carrying with the quiet authority I'd once used during board presentations. The date confusion comes from Eliza Harrington's preference for older paper stock after losing her original diary in the mill fire. I stood perfectly straight as I approached, no longer hunching my shoulders as I'd unconsciously begun doing in Vanessa's presence. I published a paper on this in the Historical Quarterly in 2009. I continued, maintaining steady eye contact with Dr. Winters, who turned toward me with interest. Vanessa's face flushed as she stepped between us. Elizabeth really should get back to the refreshments. She's been retired for years now. Accurate historical documentation doesn't expire, Vanessa, I replied, my voice quiet but carrying clearly in the suddenly silent exhibition space. Neither does expertise. For 15 seconds, no one spoke. Vanessa's throat worked visibly as she swallowed. Dr. Winters looked between us, his expression thoughtful. You're Elizabeth Watson, he finally said. Your paper on rural archival preservation techniques is required reading in my museum studies course. The warmth that spread through my chest felt foreign after months of cold dismissal. Yes, though I'm currently assigned to beverage service rather than historical consultation. The words emerged with more edge than I'd intended. Actually, Dr. Winters turned to Rebecca. I specifically requested to meet with Miss Watson during my visit. I understood she was consulting on the expansion project. Rebecca's expression froze in a rictus of professional pleasantry. There must have been some miscommunication. Elizabeth is retired and only volunteers occasionally. Yet she appears to be the authority on your most significant collection, Dr. Winters observed mildly. Perhaps we could continue our discussion somewhere more comfortable, Miss Watson. I have several questions about your authentication methodology. As I walked away with Dr. Winters, Vanessa's shocked expression burned into my peripheral vision. For 40 minutes, I engaged in the kind of scholarly discussion I'd been starved for since retirement, my voice growing stronger with each exchange. When we parted, Dr. Winters pressed his card into my hand. The university is developing a community archiving initiative. We need a consultant with your specific expertise. Would you consider it? The question hung in the air like an open door, where I'd expected only walls. I'll think about it, I replied, surprised by my own hesitation. After months of dismissal, the validation felt almost overwhelming. I drove home in heightened awareness, my mind racing through implications. I hadn't set out to challenge Vanessa publicly. I'd simply reached the point where I could no longer collude in my own erasure. At home, I moved directly to my office, powering up my computer with newfound urgency. The file I opened wasn't my resume or Dr. Winters' project description. Instead, I pulled up the digital family archive I'd been meticulously developing since retirement. What had begun as a simple cataloging project had evolved into something more ambitious, a comprehensive documentation of our family history, including recipes, photographs, and stories spanning 4 generations, all professionally organized, annotated, and presented. For months, I'd been transferring this digital archive into a professionally designed family history cookbook. The project combined my professional skills with the family traditions Vanessa so casually dismissed. Each recipe included historical context, photographs, and personal stories connecting our past to our present. I'd originally planned to reveal it at the reunion Vanessa had now commandeered. As I scrolled through the nearly completed digital file, the weight of my apparent choices settled heavily. I could directly challenge Vanessa's venue change, creating open family conflict. I could silently accept my diminishment, allowing decades of tradition to be discarded. Neither option addressed the underlying pattern of erasure, but perhaps there was a third path. The realization straightened my spine. The cookbook wasn't merely a collection of recipes, it was tangible evidence of my expertise and value. It represented exactly what Vanessa had failed to recognize, that my professional skills and family role were not obsolete, but essential. I began methodically cataloging each instance where Vanessa had overridden my preferences or dismissed my knowledge. The kitchen reorganization in March, the guest room redecoration in May, the holiday planning takeover in July, the venue cancellation this week, documented evidence created an undeniable pattern that individual incidents might obscure. In the kitchen, I made Earl Grey tea, the same blend I'd prepared during countless archival late nights. The familiar scent cleared my mind as I considered my next steps with the strategic thinking I'd once applied to preservation projects. A text message interrupted my thoughts. Dr. Winters requesting a follow-up conversation about the university consulting position. The opportunity would have thrilled me 3 months ago. Now it seemed secondary to the more personal reclamation unfolding in my office. My doorbell rang unexpectedly at 9:30 p.m. I opened it to find my 22-year-old niece, Sarah, on my porch. "Aunt Elizabeth, I'm sorry to come by so late. Mom mentioned you weren't doing the reunion at the lake this year, and I wanted to check if you're okay." Sarah had always been particularly interested in the family history elements of our gatherings. I invited her in, the familiar hollow feeling returning at the reminder of Vanessa's venue change. "It wasn't my decision," I explained, automatically aligning the coasters on my coffee table. "Vanessa felt it was time to modernize our gathering." Sarah frowned. "But you've hosted it forever. The pavilion is perfect for everyone from great-grandma to the little kids." She hesitated before adding, "I probably can't afford a fancy restaurant dinner right now anyway." The implication struck me forcefully. How many other family members would be excluded by Vanessa's upgrade? "Would you like to see what I've been working on?" I asked, making a sudden decision. In my office, I showed Sarah the family history cookbook. Her eyes widened as she scrolled through the digital pages. "This is museum-quality work, Aunt Elizabeth," she exclaimed. "I had no idea you were so tech-savvy. The way you've integrated the historical photographs with the recipes is incredible." "I digitized the entire county historical collection before retiring," I said, the words emerging with unexpected confidence. Preserving family history requires both traditional knowledge and contemporary methods. Sarah looked up with newfound respect. "Everyone thinks of you as just being good at organizing the reunion, but this is professional-level work." Just being good at organizing the reunion. The phrase illuminated the underlying issue with painful clarity. My family had reduced me to a single, increasingly marginalized function, ignoring the full scope of my capabilities. "Would it be okay if I showed this to Mom?" Sarah asked. She was really disappointed about the venue change. So were Aunt Julie and Uncle Michael. I hesitated only briefly. "Yes, but please don't share it widely yet. I'm still finalizing a few elements." After Sarah left, I returned to my computer with renewed purpose. I began creating a comprehensive visual documentation of previous family reunions, organizing photographs chronologically with detailed annotations. I identified every recurring tradition, noting which family members particularly valued each element. By midnight, I had compiled individualized digital packages for 5 key family members, each highlighting moments and memories most significant to that person. For the first time in months, the cold sensation in my chest had completely disappeared, replaced by the familiar warmth of purposeful work. My hands moved across the keyboard with confident precision they'd once applied to archival preservation. I was no longer choosing between conflict and erasure. I was creating a third option, reclamation through documentation. As I prepared for bed, I caught sight of my reflection in the bathroom mirror. My shoulders were no longer hunched, my expression no longer guarded. I recognized myself again, not as the diminished figure Vanessa had created, but as the professional I had always been. The week before the divided family gatherings passed in a flurry of purposeful activity, that reminded me of preparing major exhibitions at the Historical Society. With each methodical step, I felt my professional identity resurging, not as a faded memory, but as a living skill set. My first action was accepting Dr. Winter's consulting offer. The university needed someone to design protocols for community archive submissions, precisely the expertise I'd developed over decades. "We'll start you at $75 per hour, 10 hours weekly," he'd proposed. "More if the grant application succeeds." The validation of my professional worth wasn't just emotional, it was financial. After months of Vanessa's hints about my limited retirement income, this concrete acknowledgement sent warmth through my chest. Next, I focused on finalizing the family history cookbook. What had begun as a personal project now required the exacting standards I'd once applied to professional publications. I spent 3 days perfecting the layout, ensuring meticulous citation of sources, and triple-checking historical context for each entry. The result was museum quality, a professionally designed 108-page volume documenting 4 generations of family recipes, each accompanied by historical photographs and detailed annotations. I arranged for 10 copies to be printed and bound, the $1,240 expense feeling like an investment in reclaiming my narrative. On Wednesday morning, Martha arrived with professional-grade archival supplies I hadn't used since retirement. "I raided the storage closet," she admitted with a conspiratorial smile. "Rebecca never inventories these materials anyway." Together we created a display of historical family photographs, properly mounted and labeled with archival quality materials. I found myself automatically standing straighter, my voice dropping to its natural authoritative register as I explained my organizational system. "You sound like yourself again," Martha observed. "For months, you've been speaking in that higher, hesitant voice whenever family matters came up." I hadn't noticed the change in my speech pattern, but the observation resonated. "Vanessa prefers when I sound uncertain," I admitted. "It reinforces her position as the authority," Martha snorted. The marketing executive explaining history to the professional archivist. Classic. My phone chimed with a text from James. "Mom, Vanessa's upset about your competing event. Could you please cancel it? We've invested a lot in making the restaurant gathering special." The familiar hollow feeling threatened to return, but I breathed deeply, straightening my shoulders and responding with professional clarity. "This isn't competition, James. It's accommodation for family members who can't attend the restaurant event. You and Vanessa are welcome at both gatherings." Thursday brought unexpected reinforcement. My niece Sarah arrived with her mother Julie, both carrying shopping bags. "We thought you might need help preparing," Julie explained. "Sarah mentioned your amazing family history project." As we organized serving dishes, Julie confided, "I was so relieved when you sent those family photos. James made it sound like you supported Vanessa's venue change, but it didn't make sense. You've always been so devoted to our traditions." "My input wasn't requested," I replied simply. Julie's expression shifted. "They've been doing that a lot, haven't they? Making decisions about your life without consulting you?" The validation of my experience sent warmth through my chest. "Yes, it's been a pattern since they married. I noticed at Christmas when Vanessa rearranged all your decorations," Julie admitted. "I should have said something then. It's a common pattern with aging parents," I said, the professional assessment emerging naturally. Perceived decline in capability leads to increased intervention, regardless of actual functioning. Sarah looked up from arranging photographs. "But you're literally more qualified than any of us in preservation and organization." "That's so backwards." Julie nodded thoughtfully. "Has anyone else from the family seen these cookbooks yet?" "No," I replied. "They'll be revealed at Saturday's gathering." "Vanessa has no idea what's coming, does she?" Sarah asked, a slight smile playing at her lips. For the first time in months, I allowed myself a moment of quiet satisfaction. "She's made certain assumptions about my capabilities," I'm simply providing corrective documentation. By Friday afternoon, my home had been transformed into a carefully curated space, showcasing both family history and my professional expertise. The dining room featured the photograph display, while the living room held arrangements of family memorabilia I'd preserved over decades. In the kitchen, restored to my original organizational system, copies of the family history cookbook waited on the counter. Throughout the preparation, my posture had gradually shifted. I no longer caught myself hunching to appear less assertive. My voice maintained its professional tone, rather than rising to the higher register I'd adopted around Vanessa. Even my clothing choices had evolved. I'd selected the jewel-toned blouse and tailored pants I'd once worn for professional presentations, rather than the muted cardigans that had become my retirement uniform. Friday evening, alone in my kitchen, I experienced a moment of doubt. Was I creating unnecessary family conflict? Should I have simply accepted Vanessa's venue change? I poured myself a cup of Earl Grey tea and sat at my kitchen table, the familiar scent centering me as I considered the situation with professional objectivity. This wasn't about a venue. It was about a systematic pattern of erasure that threatened not just my family role but my identity. The evidence was clear. Vanessa had canceled established arrangements without consultation. She had misrepresented my agreement in communications with family members. She had dismissed my expertise in both professional and personal domains. She had discussed selling my home without my knowledge. Documented evidence created an undeniable pattern that individual incidents might obscure. My phone chimed with another text from James. "Mom, please reconsider this gathering. Vanessa feels blindsided and embarrassed." I set down my tea, noticing my hands remained perfectly steady. 6 months ago, such a message would have sent me retreating to maintain peace. Now I recognized it as part of the pattern. My feelings were irrelevant, while Vanessa's discomfort demanded immediate accommodation. "I understand this is uncomfortable," I replied, "but I'm not canceling an event 32 family members have confirmed they want to attend." When James called moments later, I answered with professional composure. "Mom, I don't understand why you're being so difficult," he began, his voice strained. "Vanessa was just trying to plan something nice. By canceling arrangements I'd already made without consulting me," I replied evenly. "By using my name without permission in family communications. By presenting the change as my decision when it wasn't. She was trying to help." James's voice rose in frustration. "You're making her feel unwelcome in the family. I've documented each instance where my preferences were overridden and my expertise dismissed," I replied, the methodical archivist in me fully present. "This isn't emotional, James. It's factual." The silence stretched for 15 seconds before James spoke again. "You've documented instances." "Yes," I confirmed. "With dates, specific actions, and supporting evidence. It's what I was trained to do professionally." Another long pause followed. When James spoke again, his voice had lost some of its certainty. "I didn't realize you were keeping records. History isn't just something that happens to other people, James. Our family dynamics are also worthy of accurate documentation." After we hung up, I returned to my preparations with renewed purpose. The conversation had clarified something important. James wasn't malicious. He simply hadn't witnessed the pattern, because each incident was presented as isolated and reasonable. Documentation created visibility. My last preparation was perhaps the most significant. I changed the password on my home office computer and removed the spare key James had always kept. These weren't acts of anger, but of boundary setting, another professional skill I'd developed over decades of protecting historical collections from well-intentioned damage. That night, I slept more soundly than I had in months. The cold tension that had lived in my chest completely dissolved. In its place was a steady warmth of purpose, the familiar feeling of professional competence applied to a meaningful project. Saturday morning dawned clear and bright. I woke early, aligned my bedside items at perfect right angles, and dressed in my chosen outfit. When I checked my reflection, I barely recognized the transformation. My shoulders were squared, my stance steady, my expression clear and focused. I looked like the professional I had always been, but had temporarily forgotten. The doorbell rang at precisely 11:45, 15 minutes before the gathering's official start time. I straightened my shoulders, feeling the librarian's posture that had once been as natural as breathing, and moved to welcome my first guests. The systematic erasure of Elizabeth Watson was about to be corrected with meticulous documentation and professional presentation. By noon, my living room hummed with conversation as family members examined the photograph display Martha and I had created. I moved through the space with a quiet confidence I hadn't felt in months, my posture automatically straightening whenever I shared historical context for particular images. Elizabeth, the chronological organization of these photographs is remarkable, my cousin Michael commented. You've preserved our history with museum-quality care. Preservation was my profession for 35 years, I replied, my voice resonating from my diaphragm rather than my constricted throat. I applied the same standards to our family archives. The appreciation in Michael's eyes warmed me, a direct contrast to the dismissive glances I'd grown accustomed to from Vanessa. As more relatives arrived, a pattern emerged: surprise at the professional quality of my documentation, followed by genuine interest in the historical context I provided. By 1 o'clock, 34 family members filled my home, grandparents settling into comfortable chairs, children exploring the backyard activities from previous reunions, adults clustered around the photograph displays with glasses of traditional family punch. The doorbell rang at 1:15. I opened it to find James and Vanessa standing on my porch, both dressed with the particular formality that signaled Vanessa's influence. James's expression wavered between discomfort and defiance. Vanessa's smile remained fixed and artificial. "Elizabeth, what a quaint little gathering," she exclaimed, her voice carrying too loudly. "We can only stay for a moment. We have so much to finish setting up for tomorrow's proper reunion." I maintained direct eye contact, noting how Vanessa's gaze slid away after only a few seconds. "Welcome to our family's pre-reunion gathering. Please come in." As they entered, the room's energy shifted palpably. Conversations paused momentarily as relatives observed their arrival, then resumed with a deliberate inclusiveness that professional event hosts recognize as protective social behavior. "You've certainly gone to a lot of trouble," Vanessa commented, her gaze sweeping critically over my living room. "Though I'm not sure why you felt the need to compete with tomorrow's event. Documentation and preservation aren't competitive activities," I replied evenly. "They're complementary to innovation when done thoughtfully." The professional terminology caught Vanessa off guard. Her prepared criticism faltered as she registered my squared shoulders and direct gaze. James cleared his throat, employing his habitual peacemaking gesture. "The photographs look nice, Mom." "Vanessa and I have hired a professional photographer for tomorrow, though." Much more current approach. "Elizabeth has been professionally documenting our family history for decades," my brother Thomas interjected, approaching with a glass of punch. "Her work is museum quality." Vanessa's laugh held a brittle edge. "That's sweet of you to say, but actual professional digital design is quite different from retirement hobbies." The moment had arrived sooner than I'd anticipated. I maintained a neutral expression, my voice steady as I replied, "Perhaps you'd be interested in seeing some of my current work. I've just completed a project that integrates traditional documentation with contemporary digital methods." Without waiting for her response, I moved toward the kitchen, where the family history cookbooks waited on the counter, perfectly aligned at right angles. I was acutely aware of Vanessa following, her high heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floors, now restored to their original polish. The kitchen had become the gathering's natural center, with relatives preparing traditional dishes documented in previous reunions. Conversations paused as I entered with Vanessa trailing behind, the room's attention shifting to observe this interaction. I lifted one of the bound volumes, its professional quality immediately apparent in the archival-grade materials and museum standard binding. "This is the Watson Family Historical Cookbook," I explained to the now silent room. "It documents 4 generations of family recipes with historical context, photographs, and personal narratives." Vanessa's face underwent a series of micro-expressions I'd become expert at reading during my professional career. Initial dismissal, dawning recognition of quality, and finally, poorly concealed shock. "You made this?" she asked, her voice higher than usual. "I designed, compiled, edited, and produced it," I confirmed, opening to a particularly complex page spread featuring my grandmother's holiday recipes with integrated historical photographs and detailed annotations. It applies professional archival standards to family historical documentation. My niece Sarah stepped forward. Aunt Elizabeth digitized the entire county historical collection before retiring. She's been using those same professional techniques on our family archives for decades. Vanessa's throat worked visibly as she swallowed. "It's surprisingly modern for someone of your generation." The subtle age-based dismissal hung in the air as I maintained steady eye contact. "Expertise doesn't expire with retirement, Vanessa. Neither does professional capability." James approached, his expression shifting rapidly between confusion and dawning realization as he examined the cookbook. "Mom, this is incredible. Why didn't you tell us you were creating something like this?" "I attempted to discuss it several times," I replied calmly. The conversations were consistently redirected. "That's not fair," Vanessa interjected. "You never mentioned anything this elaborate." I set the cookbook down with precise care, aligning it perfectly on the counter edge. "I have documented each instance where my expertise was dismissed or my input overridden. Would you like me to share that documentation as well?" 15 seconds of complete silence followed, broken only when my 78-year-old Aunt Margaret spoke from her seat at the kitchen table. "I'd certainly like to see it, Elizabeth. Sounds like you've been keeping excellent records." Vanessa's face flushed from neck to hairline. "That's completely unnecessary. I'm sure we've all been miscommunicating." "Miscommunication implies mutual responsibility," I observed, my tone reflecting the measured assessment I'd once used during board disputes. Unilateral decisions presented as joint ones aren't miscommunications, they're misrepresentations. James touched his neck, his habitual gesture when uncomfortable. "Mom, that's a pretty serious accusation." "It's not an accusation, James. It's documented fact." I maintained perfect composure as I continued. The email announcing the venue change stated, "Elizabeth and I have decided it's time to modernize our gathering." But I wasn't consulted, much less in agreement. The silence in the kitchen deepened as family members exchanged glances. Vanessa's breathing had become noticeably irregular, her carefully applied makeup unable to conceal the mottled flush spreading across her face. "We just wanted to make things easier for you," James attempted, his peacemaking tone strained. "We thought you'd appreciate not having all that work. The appropriate way to ease someone's burden is to ask what assistance they want," I replied. "Not to eliminate their role entirely without consultation." My cousin Michael set down his glass with a decisive click. "Elizabeth has hosted this reunion for 27 years. If anyone understands what works for our family, it's her." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the kitchen as Vanessa's expression hardened. "Well, we've already paid the deposit at Le Bistro. Anyone who cares about supporting James's and my efforts will be there tomorrow." The attempted redirection fell flat as Sarah picked up the cookbook, addressing the room rather than Vanessa. "Has everyone seen what Aunt Elizabeth created? It's not just recipes, It's our entire family history professionally documented. As Sarah began showing the cookbook to interested relatives, Vanessa turned to James. "We should go. We still have a lot to prepare for tomorrow." Before James could respond, Thomas spoke up. "Actually, I have a question about tomorrow's event. The restaurant requires a minimum expenditure of $2,500, correct? Split between how many people?" Vanessa's smile tightened. "We're expecting about 20 close family members, so approximately $125 per person," Thomas calculated. "That excludes a significant portion of the family who attended Elizabeth's gatherings. Was that intentional?" The directness of the question caught Vanessa off guard. She glanced at James for support, but he was examining the cookbook with uncharacteristic focus. "We wanted a more intimate gathering," she finally replied. "Quality over quantity." My sister Julie moved to stand beside me, her physical positioning unmistakably signaling alliance. "Our family has always prioritized inclusion over exclusivity." Elizabeth made sure everyone could participate regardless of financial circumstances. "Different approaches work for different occasions," I interjected, my professional neutrality returning. "Vanessa's event tomorrow and our gathering today serve different purposes." The measured response seemed to further unsettle Vanessa, who had clearly anticipated defensiveness rather than professional assessment. She adjusted her designer handbag with nervous fingers. "James, we really should go," she repeated, her voice pitched higher than normal. James looked up from the cookbook, his expression troubled. "I'd like to see more of this first. I had no idea Mom was creating something this significant." Vanessa's face tightened. "We have to finalize the seating arrangements." "Actually," James said slowly, "I'm wondering if we should reconsider tomorrow's event. If most of the family is already gathered here." Vanessa's composure fractured visibly. "Are you serious? After we paid a non-refundable deposit?" The irony of her complaint about a non-refundable deposit matching exactly what she'd dismissed when canceling my pavilion reservation was not lost on the assembled relatives. Several exchanged knowing glances. "Perhaps," I suggested evenly, "both events could proceed as planned. Those who wish to attend the restaurant gathering tomorrow certainly should." My diplomatic response highlighted rather than diminished the contrast between our approaches. Vanessa's increasingly obvious discomfort only emphasized my professional composure. As conversation resumed around us, Vanessa pulled James toward the living room. I allowed them space, turning my attention to relatives examining the cookbook. For 20 minutes, I answered questions about preservation techniques and historical context, my voice maintaining its natural authoritative register. When James and Vanessa re-emerged, her expression was coldly composed, while his appeared conflicted. "We need to leave now," she announced to no one in particular. "We'll see everyone tomorrow at La Bistro." I walked them to the door, maintaining my professional demeanor. "Thank you for coming." As they reached the porch, James turned back. "Mom, I had no idea about the cookbook. It's really incredible work." "There's a copy for you," I replied simply, "whenever you'd like to collect it." Throughout the evening, similar conversations recurred. By 7 o'clock, it became clear that only 5 family members planned to attend the restaurant gathering: Vanessa's parents, her brother, and James and Vanessa themselves. At 7:30, as guests began departing, my phone chimed with a text from James. "Only Vanessa's family is coming tomorrow. Can we cancel and get everyone together at your place again?" The request represented exactly the validation I'd sought. Yet I found myself responding with unexpected generosity. "The restaurant requires 24 hours notice for cancellation. Perhaps we could arrange a compromise: breakfast at your home for anyone who wishes to attend?" This solution would allow Vanessa to save face while acknowledging the clear preference for my gathering. It was the professional approach I'd have taken mediating any institutional dispute. After the last guest departed, Martha stayed to help restore order to my kitchen. "I'd say your documentation project was a complete success," she observed, carefully wrapping leftover food in containers I'd precisely labeled. "It achieved its purpose," I agreed, aligning serving dishes at perfect right angles in the cabinet. "Which was?" I considered the question as I methodically wiped down the counter. "To create an accurate record of both my professional capabilities and our family traditions." Martha smiled. "And to demonstrate clearly who's been preserving Watson family history all these years." "Documentation speaks for itself," I replied, the archivist's principle emerging naturally. Once properly cataloged, patterns become undeniable. 6 months after the divided reunions, I stood in my newly renovated home office, surrounded by professional-grade archival equipment that would have been unimaginable during my employment at the Historical Society. My consulting work with the university had expanded from 10 hours weekly to a formal position as Community Archives Program Director, a title that reflected both my expertise and the institution's respect for it. "This setup rivals our department's resources," Dr. Winters commented, adjusting his glasses as he examined my digital preservation station. "You've created a professional-level workspace in a residential setting. Conservation work requires proper tools," I replied, my voice carrying the natural authority that had once been habitual in my professional life and had now returned to my personal interactions as well. "Preserving community history deserves professional standards." My posture remained square and confident as I demonstrated the specialized scanner I'd purchased with my consulting earnings. The hunched shoulders and diminished presence I'd unconsciously adopted around Vanessa had disappeared entirely, replaced by what Martha still called my librarian stance, straight-backed, shoulders aligned, hands steady and sure in their movements. The physical transformation mirrored the internal reclamation that had unfolded since that pivotal pre-reunion gathering. The cold constriction that had lived in my chest for months had dissolved, replaced by the warm certainty of purposeful work and recognized expertise. My clothing had evolved as well. The muted, apologetic cardigans replaced by the jewel tones and tailored pieces I'd worn during my professional presentations. Today I wore a cobalt blue blouse that matched the color scheme of my redesigned office, where community members would soon bring their historical materials for documentation and preservation. "The university's quite pleased with the program development," Dr. Winters continued. 17 historical collections in the first quarter exceeds all projections. "People understand the value of preservation when approached respectfully," I observed, straightening a stack of archival folders to perfect alignment. "Most families have treasures they want documented properly." My calendar reflected more than professional engagement. It documented a life reclaimed and expanded rather than diminished by retirement. The margins contained personal notations as well. Dinner with Martha on Thursday, a museum exhibition with my sister Julie on Saturday, Sunday brunch with Sarah to discuss her growing interest in archival work. The doorbell interrupted my planning. I crossed to answer it, automatically straightening a photograph frame as I passed. James stood on my porch, holding a cardboard box. "Hi, Mom," he greeted me, his expression carrying the slightly cautious respect that had characterized our interactions since the reunion. "I found these old family photographs in our storage unit. Thought you might want to add them to your archives." I invited him in, noting how his gaze registered the changes to my home. The living room now featured a rotating display of historical family photographs I changed monthly. The dining room had been partially converted to a community consultation space. Most significantly, my home office door stood open rather than closed. My professional identity integrated into my living space rather than segregated from it. "You've made some changes," he observed, setting the box on my coffee table. "Adaptations to accommodate my current work," I corrected gently. "The core structure remains sound." The subtle reference to preservation principles wasn't lost on James. His relationship with preservation terminology had evolved significantly since witnessing the family's response to my documentation project. "The university position is going well?" he asked. "Very well. We've exceeded first quarter collection projections by 30%. James nodded. "Dad called me last week. He mentioned you're consulting on their corporate archives project." I confirmed this with a simple nod. My ex-husband's technology company had recently hired me to organize their historical documentation, a professional acknowledgement that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. He was impressed, James added. Said you're implementing systems his corporate team couldn't figure out. The validation from my ex-husband carried less weight than it once might have. My professional worth no longer required external confirmation. It was self-evident in my daily work and community impact. "Archival organization requires specialized knowledge," I replied with professional equanimity. "Most corporate environments lack that expertise." As we examined the photographs James had brought, our conversation turned to the upcoming family reunion, which had naturally returned to my coordination after the previous year's divided gatherings. "Vanessa mentioned she'd like to contribute to the planning this year," James said, his tone carefully neutral. "If that's something you'd welcome." The suggestion would have triggered immediate tension 6 months earlier. Now I considered it with professional objectivity. Her marketing background could certainly be valuable for the invitation design, I acknowledged. "Though the venue and format will remain traditional." James smiled slightly. "She assumed you'd say that. She actually suggested she could help document the event on social media, create a digital record alongside your physical archives." The proposal represented a genuine integration of our different approaches. Her contemporary skills complementing rather than replacing my traditional expertise. It signaled a transformed understanding of value that extended beyond our personal relationship. "That would be an excellent addition," I agreed. Contemporary documentation enhances historical preservation. After James departed, I returned to my office to catalog the newly acquired photographs. The methodical process centered me, each image carefully scanned, dated, and annotated with relevant family history. As I worked, I reflected on the subtle shifts in my relationship with James over the past months. Our weekly phone calls had evolved from his attempts at peacekeeping to genuine exchanges of information. He no longer framed my professional activities as retirement hobbies, but recognized them as legitimate extensions of my expertise. Most significantly, he had stopped making decisions about my life without consultation. The boundary setting that had begun with the pre-reunion gathering had established a new foundation for our relationship, one built on mutual respect rather than assumed decline. My phone chimed with a text from Martha. "Committee approved your proposal. Full funding for the Community Preservation Workshop Series." The workshop series represented an integration of my professional and personal expertise, teaching community members to preserve their own historical materials using accessible techniques drawn from my professional training. Tomorrow, I would have 25 students ranging from teenagers to octogenarians, all interested in documentation methods I'd spent decades perfecting. Among them would be my niece, Sarah, whose interest in archival work had blossomed since witnessing my professional reclamation. As evening approached, I prepared for my regular Sunday call with my daughter-in-law. Unlike the tense, performative interactions of the previous year, these weekly conversations had developed their own rhythm of professional courtesy. Vanessa and I would never share the easy warmth I enjoyed with Martha or Julie, but we had established a relationship based on mutual recognition of different but complementary areas of expertise. "Elizabeth," she greeted me when she called precisely at 6. "I've been researching social media archive techniques for the reunion documentation. I'd appreciate your input on preservation standards." The request for professional guidance represented how completely our dynamic had shifted. The woman who had once dismissed me as outdated now sought my expertise in her own work. "I'd be happy to share best practices," I replied. "Digital preservation requires the same attention to detail as physical conservation. As we discussed technical specifications for digital archiving, I noted how Vanessa's speech pattern had adapted to match my professional tone. She no longer spoke to me in the simplified, overly patient voice reserved for the elderly. Instead, she engaged with appropriate terminology and relevant questions. After our call, I moved to my garden to tend the heirloom roses I'd been cultivating for 3 decades. My next-door neighbor Eleanor waved from her porch. "Elizabeth, would you have time this week to help document my grandmother's recipe collection before they deteriorate further?" "Thursday afternoon would work well," I called back. "Bring them by and we'll assess the appropriate preservation methods." Such requests had become increasingly common as word spread about my expertise. I'd established clear professional boundaries: consulting hours, appropriate compensation, scheduled appointments, rather than allowing my skills to be casually appropriated. These boundaries extended to family relationships as well. When Vanessa had attempted to volunteer me for holiday hosting without consultation, I'd responded with professional clarity: "I'm available to coordinate documentation, but my schedule doesn't permit hosting this year." The response had established both my continued expertise and my autonomy without creating unnecessary conflict. My phone chimed with a text from Sarah. Professor Jenkins suggested I apply for the summer archiving internship. "Would you be willing to review my application?" The request warmed me in a way professional acknowledgement alone never could. Beyond reclaiming my own narrative, I was potentially influencing another generation of preservation specialists. "I'd be happy to review it," I replied. "Stop by during Tuesday's consultation hours." Sunday morning dawned, clear and bright. I dressed in one of my professional outfits, a burgundy blouse with tailored black pants, and prepared for the community workshop planning session at the university. As I gathered my materials, I caught sight of my reflection in the hallway mirror. The woman who gazed back bore little resemblance to the diminished figure of a year earlier. My posture remained naturally straight, my movements purposeful, my expression composed but engaged. I had reclaimed not just my professional identity, but my physical presence in the world. My voice had permanently returned to its natural register, the clear, authoritative tone I developed during decades of professional presentations. My hands moved with confident precision rather than apologetic hesitation. Even my walking pace had quickened to its former purposeful stride. As I locked my front door, I noticed a familiar car approaching, James and Vanessa arriving for an unscheduled visit. 6 months earlier, such an unexpected appearance would have triggered immediate accommodation, rearranging my plans to meet their unspoken expectations. Now I greeted them with professional courtesy while maintaining my boundaries. "Good morning. I'm just leaving for a workshop planning session at the university. Did we have an appointment I've forgotten?" The question was offered without apology or defensiveness, a simple statement of my professional commitments. James looked momentarily surprised, then shook his head. "No, sorry. We should have called first. We were hoping to discuss some family history questions for a project Vanessa's working on." "I have consultation hours on Tuesday from 2 to 4, I replied, exactly as I would with any community member seeking my expertise. "You're welcome to schedule time then." Vanessa nodded with professional acceptance. "Tuesday at 2 would be perfect. We'll bring the materials we need assistance with." The exchange represented everything that had transformed in our relationship. They no longer assumed immediate access to my time. I no longer felt compelled to accommodate unscheduled requests. Most significantly, they now approached me for professional expertise, rather than attempting to manage my contributions. As I drove to the university, I reflected on the year's journey, from systematic erasure to professional reclamation. The transformation hadn't required dramatic confrontation or emotional outbursts. It had emerged through consistent documentation and professional presentation, the same skills I'd applied throughout my career. The university parking lot was nearly empty on Sunday morning. As I gathered my materials from the passenger seat, I caught sight of my reflection in the car window, straight-backed, purposeful, engaged. I recognized myself completely. Elizabeth Watson, professional archivist and family historian, had fully returned. The woman who had temporarily disappeared beneath layers of dismissal and accommodation had re-emerged through methodical documentation and quiet persistence. As I walked toward the humanities building where Dr. Winters waited, my stride remained steady and confident. Each step carried me forward into a life I had reclaimed through the very expertise others had attempted to dismiss, the professional capacity to recognize what deserved preservation, and the personal determination to ensure it endured.